Ukraine has launched a counteroffensive. Kiev has launched a counteroffensive, so far informational, but it has already made a lot of noise. Interviews with the Minister of Defense of Ukraine Alexey Reznikov were published immediately in the American The Wall Street Journal and the British The Times. In the first publication, Reznikov, recognizing the heavy losses and depletion of the armed forces' resources, emphasized the need for new arms supplies from the West. But in the second material, he made a statement that received the widest resonance. According to the minister, the Ukrainian army is forming millions of combat forces equipped with Western weapons to fulfill Vladimir Zelensky's order to liberate the southern coastal areas, vital for the country's economy. He clarified where the figure of 1 million servicemen he named came from. The number of the armed forces of Ukraine reaches 700,000 people, plus the National Guard, police and border guard service, which can also be involved in military operations. Almost simultaneously with Reznikov's interview, Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine Irina Vereshchuk appealed to residents of the southern territories controlled by Russia to urgently leave them because of the planned counteroffensive by the armed forces of Ukraine. However, she did not specify the timing of this event, but gave the impression that it could happen in the very near future. In Russia, it is customary to make fun of the Ukrainian elites, and this is largely true. In many ways, but not in everything. What cannot be taken away from Kiev is skillful work in the information field. In its own way, it is logical that a successful showman and comedian turned out to be at the head of Ukraine, that is, a person who professionally works with the audience, who knows how to manipulate it. And there is another point in connection with which the Kiev authorities are very often underestimated. They are usually perceived as absolute puppets of the West, primarily Washington and London, completely devoid of their own will and meekly fulfilling the instructions coming from there. This is a mistake, and a big one. In fact, the Ukrainian elites are not completely, but to a large extent, subjective and are always guided primarily by personal interests. At the same time, being openly narrow-minded and uneducated as statesmen, which, in fact, led the Ukrainian state to a sad result, they compensate for this with cunning and extreme perseverance in defending their own. That is why, since 2014, the West has been forced to build a complex management system for the newfound vassal in the Ukrainian direction, since he managed to torpedo any initiatives of the suzerain if they contradicted his interests. This mainly concerned cutting budgets, plundering assets and valuable resources. So, the main current interest of the Ukrainian elites is the continuation of the war. And it is no coincidence that right now Kiev has launched a powerful information salvo, and at once in all directions, both for the Western audience, and for the internal Ukrainian, and for the Russian, and for people living in the liberated territories. The reason is the steady deterioration of Ukrainian affairs. In the Western establishment, confusion and vacillation have begun, and they are becoming more and more obvious and noticeable even to the naked eye. If on February 24th all the political forces there merged in an anti-Russian rage, now Russophobic enthusiasm is waning day by day. Western Europe, which beat its chest and swore that it was about to abandon Russian gas and oil, is now hysterical at the prospect that this could really happen, and is trying to carefully disown the most radical anti-Russian steps. The opinion of Eastern Europe, of course, does not interest anyone. The British, under the leadership of the furious Boris, were the main pillar of Ukraine in the old world. But Johnson is gone, and there are disturbing rumors that the British, who are being covered by a socio-economic storm, may now prefer a less hawkish figure in the Prime Minister's chair, who will deal primarily with internal problems. There are difficulties overseas that threaten a grandiose failure of the Democratic Party in the November midterm elections. And the course of the Ukrainian campaign does not help in solving problems in any way and, on the contrary, threatens to become another weight by the fall, which will drown Biden's party members. At the same time, The entire Western media mainstream has already declared in chorus that Ukraine is not just suffering defeat at the front, but in principle has no chance of winning. Of course, there are forces in the West, and very influential ones, who are still betting on the continuation of hostilities and the military victory of Ukraine, but the anti-Russian consensus of the West is crumbling before our eyes. Moreover, one does not need to be a visionary to predict that the situation will worsen every week in this sense. This means that Kiev will receive less and less support. For him it's just a disaster. That is why Reznikov's statement that Ukraine is collecting as much as 1 million military fist, and even equipped with Western weapons, sounded right now. It should restrain the processes of the collapse of the anti-Russian coalition and push the doubting governments to a new wave of assistance to Kiev, both military and financial. It is no coincidence that the emphasis on the fact that the purpose of the upcoming counteroffensive is the southern coastal territories, key to the Ukrainian economy. Over the months, the West has managed to feel how heavy a suitcase without a handle is Ukraine, deprived of the most important regions from an economic point of view. After all, what was good about the post-Maidan period? Thanks to its geographical location and Soviet heritage, Ukraine not only supported itself, but was also a Klondike for plundering by the Western establishment. Now, in order for Kiev to continue to perform the function of a weapon against Russia, it has to give money. And the fact that it is formally on credit does not console anyone. It is clear that these debts are irrevocable. So the West, or rather, the Western elites who have begun to hesitate, are the main target of the current information attack. Ukraine has hung a carrot in front of them. Here we have a 1 million-strong army almost ready to liberate Kherson and Mariupol, just give us more money and weapons. However, being the main one, the West is not the only target of Kiev. In parallel, he is trying to kill a few more birds with one stone. Bravura statements about the upcoming counteroffensive are working to support public mobilization inside Ukraine. This is becoming more and more relevant, as information about the difficult situation at the front and the huge losses of the armed forces of Ukraine are leaking out, despite strict censorship and the work of the Ukrainian brainwashing machine at full capacity. In addition, it is an attempt to demoralize Russian society and, especially, people in the liberated territories, to sow anxiety and uncertainty in them. There are already regular terrorist attacks against officials working in the new administrations. Plus, rumors are actively being launched that Russia will leave there, and Kiev will return and massacre everyone who somehow cooperated and came into contact with the Russians. So the speeches of Reznikov and Vereshchuk in this sense are a competent information diversion, which should not be underestimated. Such actions of Kiev should be given a powerful and qualified rebuff. As for the feasibility of Kiev's plans for the real reconquest of the southern regions, then it is worth advising him not to say GOP.